Before we begin, a quick note. The opinions and analysis shared on Truth Seekers are our own interpretations of published research and should not be used as medical, financial, or professional advice. Always consult qualified professionals for decisions affecting your health or well-being.
And with that out of the way, welcome to Truth Seekers. I'm Bill Morrison.
And I'm Alex Barrett. Today is April 6, 2026, and we're talking about... Right, so I want to start with a headline I saw absolutely everywhere last month. Drinking 2 to 3 cups of coffee daily reduces your dementia risk by 18%. And I'll be honest, my first instinct was, brilliant, science finally did something useful for me personally.
Let's get to the truth. Yeah, I had the same reaction for about 30 seconds. Then I actually looked at the study and, okay, this one has layers.
Because it's not that the study doesn't exist. It's real, it's big, it's in JAMA. This isn't some wellness blogger making things up.
Right, and that's what makes it worth digging into. The study involved over 130,000 people, followed for, actually, was it 40 years or
Up to 43 years.
up to 43 years, out of Harvard? So when people saw JAMA, Harvard, 130,000 participants, they thought settled science.
Which is exactly how the headlines wanted them to react. I remember covering health stories, and every PR person I ever dealt with knew, you get JAMA in the lead, you're done. People stop reading after that. Your morning coffee is protecting your brain. I saw it framed as basically a prescription. Here's your cognitive health intervention. It's delicious. Enjoy.
But here's the thing, and this is where we need to start. The word that matters most in that headline is reduces, because reduces implies coffee is doing something active, that it's the cause. And this study fundamentally cannot show that.
Because it's observational.
Exactly. They didn't give half these people coffee and tell the other half to stop drinking it. They watched what 130,000 people already did over decades and looked for patterns. And there is a real important difference between watching a pattern and proving what's driving it.
Give me the analogy. You always have an analogy.
Okay, people who eat caviar regularly tend to have higher incomes. Does caviar cause wealth?
If anything, it's the reverse.
Right, the pattern is real. The data would show it. But the causation is backwards, or it's something else entirely. And in nutrition research especially, this happens constantly. Two things travel together without one causing the other.
So the coffee drinkers in this study had lower dementia rates. But maybe coffee drinkers just happen to be healthier people for a whole bunch of reasons nobody measured.
That's the honest question the data raises. And the researchers actually say this themselves. The lead author's direct quote is that the effect size is small, and the study cannot distinguish whether caffeinated coffee reduces dementia risk from whether cognitively healthier people simply maintain higher coffee consumption for longer.
That's quite a significant thing to say about your own study.
It is, and I genuinely respect them for it. The problem is that caveat doesn't make it into the headline.
Never does. So that's one issue, correlation versus causation. But you said this one has layers.
It does. And this is the part I find genuinely fascinating. Here's a question. If caffeine is the brain protecting ingredient in coffee, what would you expect to happen with decaffeinated coffee?
Same beans, same antioxidants, same polyphenols, just without the caffeine. So you'd expect a similar benefit, or at least some benefit?
That would be the prediction. And the researchers tested it specifically. They looked at whether decaf drinkers showed the same association with lower dementia risk.
And
Nothing. Zero. Decaf showed no protective association whatsoever.
Okay, so that could mean caffeine specifically is doing the work, which actually supports the coffee story?
That's where some of the coverage went. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. In some of the cognitive sub-analyses, higher decaffeinated coffee consumption was actually associated with worse verbal memory performance in women.
Hold on, worse?
Worse. The authors flag it very cautiously. They say it needs careful interpretation. It's not the headline finding. But the direction of that result is odd if you believe coffee compounds are protecting cognition.
Right, but wait, I want to push back on this a bit because you could read that decaf result two ways. You could say it proves caffeine is doing something specific, which is actually quite a tidy story, or you could say what you're about to say, which is that it's evidence of confounding. Why are you so confident it's the second one?
Because decaf has essentially the same plant chemistry as regular coffee. If antioxidants or polyphenols, any physical compound in the drink, were doing protective work, you'd expect to see it show up in both groups. The fact that it goes in opposite directions depending on whether there's caffeine, that pattern doesn't make chemical sense. What it does make sense as is two different types of coffee drinkers who are different from each other in ways the study didn't measure.
So it's not that caffeine is doing something, it's that caffeinated coffee drinkers are a different population.
Almost certainly. And I take your point. It's a reasonable alternative read for about 30 seconds. But the more you sit with it, the less it holds together.
Okay, yeah, actually, I think you're right. And when you put it that way, the directionality flipping, that's the bit that really does it for me. That's not noise, that's a signal about the sample. Exactly. And when you look at who was actually studied here, that starts to make a lot of sense. Tell me about the sample, because I flagged this too. So the 130,000 participants came from two cohorts, the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-up Study. We're talking exclusively about nurses and healthcare professionals. And actually, I know this isn't the point, but those cohorts are remarkable research infrastructure. The Nurses' Health Study has been running since 1976. It's one of the largest investigations of women's health ever conducted. The depth of data they've generated is, Bill,
Right, yes. Not the point.
not the point. So, not a random cross section of humanity. And this matters in a specific way. Healthcare professionals have, on average, higher education levels, better access to medical care, more cognitively demanding jobs, more health literacy. They are not representative, and the authors actually acknowledge this directly. And cognitive reserve, the mental buffer you build through complex work and education, that's one of the most robustly evidenced factors in dementia protection we have.
Exactly. So when you're already studying a group with higher cognitive reserve, more regular health checkups, probably better overall lifestyle habits, and you find that coffee drinkers within that group have lower dementia rates than non coffee drinkers, you genuinely cannot separate coffee did this from these two groups were already different in ways the questionnaires couldn't capture.
And this is what frustrates me about how it got covered, because there's a real human consequence here. If you don't drink coffee and you saw that headline, you might think, right, I should start for my brain. That's a completely reasonable response to how this was presented.
And the data doesn't support that decision. You cannot take a finding from a self selected cohort of healthcare professionals and say, therefore, add coffee to your routine and reduce your dementia risk. The researchers didn't claim that, the headlines did.
And look, we've been here before with coffee, haven't we? Didn't we do an episode? It was the study where, what, 92 people?
Yeah, the cardiovascular one. 92 people doing a step test, their heart rate was measured, and somehow that became high caffeine intake increases your risk of heart disease. Global panic. Completely contradicted the long term research on over a million people.
Right. And now here we are on the other side. Enormous study, legitimate journal, and the problem is the headline overclaiming in the opposite direction. Coffee can apparently cause a panic or a prescription, just never anything in between.
Coffee really does get a ride in the press.
It really does. Anyway, what about the actual number? Because 18% still sounds significant to people. That's not nothing.
So, this is the relative versus absolute distinction. And it always sounds pedantic, but it genuinely matters. When I was doing A B testing, this was the thing that would come back to bite a product team every single time. You'd run a test, see a 20% improvement, then realize you'd moved from one conversion in 1,000 to 1.2 in 1,000. And suddenly it's a very different conversation. Same thing here. 18% is the relative reduction, comparing the highest coffee consumers to the lowest. In absolute terms, we're looking at roughly 140 cases per 100,000 person years in high coffee drinkers versus 330 in non drinkers. The authors themselves describe the effect size as modest.
Hmm. And then there's the cognitive test data specifically, which is actually the most telling part. The most objective measure they used, a composite global cognition score, failed to reach statistical significance. The p value was 0.06. Okay, but this is where I want to push back because I actually think the p value thing cuts harder than you're letting on. If the cognitive tests didn't reach significance, how real is this finding? Like, genuinely? The dementia diagnosis numbers did reach significance, fine, but isn't the cleaner test the actual score on the cognitive measure?
So, yes and no. The p value of zero point zero 0.06 means it just missed the conventional cutoff of zero point zero 0.05. We're not talking about a p value of zero point 0.4 here. It's right at the edge of we're not sure.
Right at the edge is still the wrong side of the edge.
For that specific measure, yes. And I don't want to dismiss that. The gap between the dementia diagnoses reaching significance and the objective cognitive scores not reaching it is genuinely worth sitting with. That's a real tension in the paper.
It's the kind of thing that should be in the headline, not buried.
Completely agree. What I'd push back on is the idea that it invalidates the whole study. The dementia diagnosis numbers are real data. The association is real. It just means this study is useful evidence that something might be happening, not confirmation that it is.
So the study isn't wrong, the headlines are wrong.
Essentially. And actually, that framing matters because if you threw this study out entirely, you'd lose legitimate longitudinal data from 130,000 people. That's worth something. It just doesn't support the conclusion the headlines drew from it.
Okay, so where does this actually land?
The association is real. Caffeinated coffee drinkers in this cohort had lower dementia rates. That's not fabricated data. And this association has shown up consistently across multiple studies over the years. What this study does well is confirm that moderate coffee consumption is probably not cognitively harmful and may, over a lifetime, modestly contribute to lower risk. That's a defensible, honest takeaway.
The headline should have been Coffee probably not hurting your brain. Less exciting, significantly more accurate.
And if someone already drinks 2 or 3 cups a day and enjoys it, This study is a small reassurance. What it is not is a reason to start drinking coffee you don't want, or to add an extra cup as a deliberate brain protection strategy.
Because the things that actually have stronger, more consistent evidence for protecting cognition, physical activity, quality sleep, social connection, cognitive engagement, managing cardiovascular risk, none of those got the JAMA splash last month.
Because sleep and exercise remain good for your brain, doesn't go viral. Coffee does.
So here's what to actually take from this. The next time you see a nutrition headline with a percentage attached, the first question is observational study or randomized trial? Because if it's observational, the story is always these two things travel together in this group. It is never this thing caused that thing.
And the decaf question is a genuinely useful gut check you can apply yourself. If compound X is doing the protective work, removing compound X should change the result. When it doesn't, or when it flips direction, that's your signal that something else is going on underneath.
The study did real work. It's genuinely useful data. And the researchers were honest about what it can and can't show. It just got handed to headlines that were doing something the data doesn't support.
Which is exactly why we're here.
Right, that's all for today's dive into the data. Just remember, everything we've discussed is our interpretation of published research and shouldn't replace professional medical advice.
Absolutely. If you're dealing with health or mental concerns, talk to your doctor, not just us data nerds on a podcast.
I'm Alex Barrett,
And I'm Bill Morrison
and we'll see you next time.
on Truth Seekers.
Until then, question everything.
But verify with data.